to all the listeners, how old are you? Are you old school? I'm talking about old school, old school. Well, not too old school, but let's just say pretty much if you're an 80s baby, maybe early 90s, but mostly definitely, most definitely if you're an 80s baby. And maybe if you're an early 90s baby. You remember playing handheld games where when Christmas come, they have the Tiger electronic games that don't have no lights or no, they just are very electronic games that made of ink and everything. And you had to put batteries in it. That old. You had to play handheld games with batteries. I'm not talking about chargeable batteries like they have today. I mean batteries as in double A batteries and some maybe triple A's or and in some cases you got toys and games that have like C batteries and 9 volts and D batteries. Well, I'm pretty sure you all know what this is on the screen. This is the Sega Game Gear, and I think for its time, it's the graphics for its time is phenomenal for its time. But I also think that this was a waste of technology and a waste of money as well. Here's the reason why: the batteries on that don't last long, and I think they did a little too extra on it, like too much extra. Because I don't think that the people, especially in the gaming world or the technology world, this was I don't think everybody was ready for a high tech electronic game of its time. Because you got to remember, Sega and Nintendo at the time they were rivals, and Nintendo at that time already had a Game Boy. In fact, the Game Gear came out a little over a year after the Game Boy, and a lot of people got the Game Boy, and of course Sega company decided to maybe do a little competition with Nintendo and have their own handheld game, and they put a little extra on it. I say extra, I mean extra because I never had a Game Gear. My brother had it, but I used to play his Game Gear a lot, and I used to kind of envy him at that time because he had a Game Gear, and I think I played it more than he did. But within the Game Gear, the lightings was good. I mean, it was real colorful. The graphics was phenomenal. I ain't gonna lie. Back in because this happened back in Christmas of '94, and I still had a Game Boy because I had that Game Boy for like a year or two maybe. But he ended up getting the Game Gear, and when I saw that, I look at it, I'm like, that's real cool. And we went to put a battery on there, and I think the game that he got that came with it was Sonic 2. I think Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Now that was a good game. That was a classic. But went in to put the batteries in, and we start playing. Everybody got a turn to play. Oh, I can do. Let me play. Let me play. Let me play. Cause let me be honest with you. This is at the time in the '90s, early '90s. This was the game that caused kids to want to fight over because it was awesome at the time. But one small minor detail: we did not long put batteries in it, and it just shut off. Like, doop. I'm like, wait a second. Do y'all put some cheap batteries in there? Because there is no way that this thing can shut off within that short amount of time. When I say short, I mean because we I think can't remember what kind of batteries we had in there. It didn't last an hour. It last might have been about 30, 45 minutes, and I think either my grandmother or my dad they would say, "Well, y'all play that thing long enough. Of course, the batteries are going to die." I say, "Yeah. I mean, I got a Game Boy. My Game Boy batteries last much longer than this." And they just decided to go back to the store and get more batteries. This time, like Energizer, I think, or we the Duracell, one of those strong batteries. And we put it in, and exactly, I would say like maybe an hour and a half, because this is one of those Duro batteries. So I say like an hour and a half, it shut off again. I like, nah, this don't make no sense. I mean, an hour and a half, it shut off again. And they thinking that it could be something wrong with the game, and they want to. At first, they was talking about probably taking it to the store, maybe to to see if they can get another one, but they think maybe it just how good and rich that system is. It put out use a lot of energy and everything, a lot of battery energy. It probably no wonder it shut off real quick. So sometimes later, I think my brother ended up having an adapter, and that's when we can play as long as we like. And of course, we'd be like, oh, yippee, yay, whatever. So we had the adapter and replayed for a long time. We was satisfied of it, and the sound of that Game Gear was so loud. I mean, it was real loud. And I still have my Game Boy. Now, I remind you now, the Game Boy was still hot, and according to I actually look it up, the Game Boy was still selling pretty good, and the Game Gear started off real great, but it went downhill, and I think they got something to do with low battery power and everything. But eventually, when we used that adapter, the adapter actually went out. Like it actually caused a shortage to be in the system, and I was actually playing it, and my brother said, "Boy, what you did?" I said, "I didn't do anything. I just played." But he didn't make a big gripe or fuss about it. But he said, "You run this thing out of electricity. How you did that?" I'm like, "I didn't do nothing. I just turned it on. Next thing you know, it just whipped off." And pretty much that was the end of that. Like you couldn't even turn it on because even it just easily shuts off. And we tried putting batteries in it, and it still wouldn't come on. And that was the end of it. So I say to myself, and I reflect on that because what made me want to do this video is I went to the game exchange place somewhere, and that just kind of brought back childhood memories. And I also seen people talk about it, saying that they remember they have something like that, and they all say the same thing: the batteries don't run low. I mean, the batteries run real fast on it. It's during that time, it's a great game, and I don't think, like I say earlier, the whole world wasn't ready for something that powerful because, mind you, now Game Boy Color came out maybe some years later, and that's the predecessor of Nintendo. I was going to say Sega Genesis was, no, I'm sorry, Sega Game Gear was the Nintendo Game Boy's predecessor, but they're Sega and Nintendo at that time they were rivals. So I wouldn't say predecessor. So Sega didn't really have a successor or a predecessor. That was it because at the time Sega Genesis was they were doing good. They were good at the time when they came out with Sega Saturn, and Sega Saturn didn't do much good, so they came out with the Sega Dreamcast and they totally flopped. So Sega just went out of business and just give up their shares and stuff. And I think that would end up happening with Sega. They just went out the way of the dodo. So a waste of technology, a waste of time. They shouldn't did do a little. They did a little too much on there to appease the crowd and try to outmaneuver Nintendo. And Nintendo Game Boy is still top selling. And I think the Game Gear may have discontinued around '97, somewhere in the late '90s, if I'm not mistaken. And Nintendo at that time during the late '90s, they came out with Pokemon, and a lot of people are still buying Nintendo. In fact, the Nintendo Game Boy had like the Game Boy Pockets, and of course, they also had like the Game Boy Colors, and you still couldn't see in the dark. So Nintendo kind of did it smart. They waited because they know that putting too much color in that and lighting that can cause, I guess, battery to go out real fast. So they came out with lightings and stuff you can add on to it, which is very smart. And eventually they came out with the Game Boy Advance and then the Nintendo DS and the Switch, you know. But all this goes to show you that sometimes when it comes to like technology, people want to jump ahead and advance, but technology take time. Nintendo did it the right way, but Sega didn't. And with the Game Gear, it was way ahead of its time. In fact, the Nintendo DS is actually, in a way, I would say kind of parallel to Game Gear. Game Gear would have done good during the Nintendo DS era, and that's like around the early 2000s, around mid 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. So the Game Gear is very equivalent to the mid 2000s, except they, I'd say the company, they tried to overdo themselves, but they didn't know it's going to be this amount of problem. But Nintendo did it right. They've been a little patient with it. But have you ever owned a Sega Game Gear, and were you even disappointed at that? And do you also believe that this is a waste of technology or a waste of money? Because I think it is, and despite of me enjoying it, I didn't really enjoy it to the fullest. It's no winner. It's no games. Even with the Sonic game, I didn't really beat the game because it didn't. I just couldn't play it long enough. But tell me what you think.